All right.
All right, thanks everyone for joining August 2nd TST meeting. Today we have 3 topics. One is just an update to the TST on the transition of the ONOS project from ON.Lab to ONF. The second topic is on a proposal around the module owner program. And the third is a proposal to promote some of the features we have in Incubator up to core. So we'll get started in that order. For the first, there's 2 major things that are associated with the ONF transition. The first is a new CLA, which was active as of this morning. The lawyers tell us that all contributors, regardless of their affiliation, need to sign it. And I think we already have like 30 developers that have signed it for ONOS. And that basically just is authorizing or giving the contributions or a license to the contributions to ONF as opposed to ON.Lab. The other thing that's coming soon, I just have to get the script worked out, is we'll be updating the copyright line at the top of every source file to read Open Networking Foundation. So that'll be a pretty significant check-in, but it should not cause too many merge conflicts, given that most people are not editing that line of most files. So it shouldn't really.
Do you backdate those as well? So if the current copyright is, I don't know, ON.Labs 2012, does it become Open Networking Foundation 2012 or Open Networking Foundation 2017?
Because it's an asset transfer, the copyrights will get backdated.
Okay.
However, if you were to take this as a third party, right, as David Bainbridge, you wanted to fork ONOS and go off and do things on your own outside of the ONF, you'd have to leave the ONF line intact, and then you could append your own line on top of it.
Okay.
So yeah, it'll be backdated, and that's just because the IP or licenses, so to speak, were transferred to the ONF. So that's what the lawyers tell us to do. Is,
okay.
Replace the line.
It's more curiosity than anything else.
Yeah. But yeah, typically the addition of a line is typical when you want to fork a project and maintain a copyright of your own fork. But yeah, it'll be replacement and backdated. And then new files that come in will just have the 2017 to present situation.
So what happens to existing forks of ONOS that want to merge in code post ONF?
So in order to, so if you have old code that's licensed under the old agreement, it's fine. But for any new contributions to the project, they'd have to be done under a CLA with ONF.
All right, I understand. I was just kind of suggesting that basically this kind of messes things up for forks of ONOS, because then they're going to end up with all these different random copyright messages potentially, or maybe they should just, I don't know what you recommend them to do. Probably you recommend them to rebase with all the changes. It sort of goes back to my original suggestion that you just have it in one file rather than in every single file, because then it's horrible chaos. Just saying.
Good to hear your voice, Bob.
Yeah, I think.
Wait, can you hear me? Am I too loud? I can't really talk. Okay, good.
You're fine, Bob.
I think that as long as the person who does the fork doesn't mess with the header at the top, the merge should happen fairly automatically. The only time you get a merge conflict is if both sources have edited the line. So if the contributor rebases their code, as the Garrett workflow requires, they shouldn't have a massive merge conflict to deal with. Okay, so that's that. That was more of an informational piece. The second topic is module owner program changes, and so the basic proposal here is currently the module owner plugin tries to identify, I believe it's 2 module owners based on their ownership paths. It tries to do so with the most specific module owners first, and then less specific module owners if it's able to. But for super module owners, this has led to a fair bit of sort of noise in their Git incoming reviews inbox and their email inbox as well. And so the proposal here is to drop the .star reviewers from automatic inclusion on the module owner plugin. And if there are super module owners that are interested in automatically being added to reviews for certain areas of code, they can just add whatever path they want to track explicitly. And then I think on the Git blame plugin, we have 3 users that are automatically added. And the proposal would be to reduce that number to 2. Again, I think that we get fairly good coverage of the number of reviewers that get automatically added. And one of the challenges is that there's this, you open a review, there's 6 reviewers on it. It's hard to tell who's actually going to be actively reviewing it. So with a smaller number, hopefully it'll be clearer to people when they get a review that this is code they may want to take a look at. We can also tell developers that they should be a bit more proactive about adding and removing reviewers from reviews if they know who they're targeting with particular changes. So I guess I can just codify that. Assign to .star to MOs via .star, have module owners add explicit paths they want, and reduce number of reviewers by blame. So if there's no objections, we can make those changes.
I guess the question is, if we reduce the number of reviewers to 2, we just got to make sure the 2 that it's reduced to are actually actively reviewing.
Well, so there's 2 ways that reviewers get added. One is by Git blame, and so it looks at who was the last person, who has the most overlap in code that you've updated, and so it takes I think currently it's the 3 most relevant reviewers based on code you've edited, and tries to automatically assign them. So it would just be 1 fewer there. And then additionally, we also assign 2 reviewers based on module ownership. And so currently, if we have a module owner that is like tracking apps forwarding or something, then if that, we look at the module owners that have the most degree of overlap with the changes that are coming in, and then assign those module owners accordingly for review. So this would just be stop using the super module owner designation, which is just .star, to compute that overlap.
Okay.
The next step here, which I'm not proposing to do now, but I'm thinking might be good, is that this will enable us to take a look at reviews that are coming in that get very few number of reviewers assigned, like 0 or 1. And then that might help us identify areas where we need to improve our module ownership coverage.
Would that address your concern, David?
Yeah, I think it does. I just, again, the key is going to be that to make sure that people actually review, and I know people get bogged down and get focused on other things, right?
Yeah.
And we just want to make sure that the tail of the reviews doesn't get too long.
Yeah, well, the thing is, I understood, but I mean, it could also be argued the opposite, right? By the diffusal of responsibility created by adding too too many reviewers is leading to the same.
I absolutely agree with that. The number of reviewers actually doesn't have any real effect here in terms of that.
Right.
Or it could, I guess it could, because someone could say, oh, they have 20 reviewers, someone else will handle it.
Yeah,
And so maybe reducing the reviewers will help.
that was the hypothesis, is that, oh, there's 8 reviewers on here, someone else is taking care of it. Whereas if you open a review and it's 2 reviewers, it's like, okay, well, maybe I should take care of it. And instead of getting put on 10 reviews with each 8 reviewers each, maybe you get put on 2 or 3 reviews with 2 or 3 reviewers each. So it's just trying to be more selective about who these get assigned to.
No, that makes sense.
Cool. So are there any objections to that, to moving forward with those 2 actions?
No, I like that.
Okay, cool. So we'll try to get that done in the near future.
Yeah. Also, just on a related note, while we're talking about module owners and code reviews, probably everybody saw my message about the unit tests for the code reviews. So this is just a sort of a friendly reminder to make sure that module owners and code reviewers in general start looking at presence of unit test codes for, especially for newly added code or new functionality.
Cool. So I think that's the end of my topic. Thomas, the next was yours.
Yeah. So I briefly talked to Jono one-on-one. I think there are a number of pieces of functionality currently nested under the incubator, which have, in my view, long since matured. And specifically, that would be the net neighbor, the interface management, and the routing specifically. And there might be others, but we ought to consider, starting the process to move those out of the incubator area and into the core area. I think it'll have to be done in order to preserve backwards compatibility. It'll have to be done gradually, probably by first deprecating the existing systems in place and then moving the interfaces to the core API. And then we can remove the deprecated ones after and it goes out.
Which were the 3 subsystems you mentioned, Thomas?
I think it's the interfaces management. It will be under net in INTF.
Yep.
It's the net neighbor, which is the neighbor management, default neighbor management, and routing.
Okay.
I think the virtual network, the tunnel, and RPC can still remain there. And I think that the resource label stuff can remain there for the time being. But if somebody thinks something else that I forgot, potentially that could also be going there, we should consider it. I think also
the multicast stuff could be taken out as well.
Where is that at? Oh yeah, is that on config basic? I see that.
There should be an
MCAST?
Yeah, where's
Oh yeah, I see. I was just looking under the I was just looking under the API stuff. Okay. For now.
Interestingly, the multicast route service API is in the core API and the implementation is in the incubator.
We can move that one right away.
Yeah. So I think we should start making moves, right? It should be. I think the move itself can happen quickly. It's just the removal of some of the interfaces.
So Thomas, is the plan to move it into core, which comes with a package rename?
Yes.
And then produce shell interfaces and classes which extend the core ones?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. For backwards compatibility,
And,
exactly.
and deprecate the shells.
Exactly.
Thomas, I thought we were under no moral obligation to support the Incubator APIs.
That's true, but I would still, yeah, you're right, but that's a good point. But I was still, I guess, trying to play nice.
Okay.
Yeah, I would say this. Show we have no obligation to support them, but they're used by a lot of different apps and a lot of different things, and so we don't want to just break everybody in one go, right? Like, it's this thing of like, yeah, you say it's beta, but if you have enough people using it, then it's not really beta anymore, right? You kind of just break it. So.
Okay. So then the proposal would be to put these shims in place, remove the actual code, deprecate the shims, and then release it down the line, get rid of the shims.
Exactly. And I think we can get rid of the shims a little more aggressively than normally.
I live with that.
And I would suggest we actually try to complete this work as part of the Loon release.
Yeah, I was going to say we should do this for 111.
Yeah, exactly.
Shim business.
Yeah.
More generally, do we want to have a mechanism by which people can try to propose that their stuff be merged into core, or are we going to treat this on a more ad hoc basis?
Isn't there a process for this? I remember there being a written one and Bill going over it and stuff like that.
I mean, I don't see a need to formalize it. I mean, clearly, I think it's just somebody know this is something that's mature, let's just move it, or somebody would consider something mature, just propose it, just use the TST to consider it, discuss it, and then move forward with it or not. I'm not sure we need to establish another. I mean, if you're talking about maybe just writing a couple of bullet points in around this area on a wiki, that's fine. Just so that it's more explicit, but I don't think it needs to be something that's terribly formal.
Okay. We could also, just put a note somewhere that says, when you think a feature in Incubator is ready for.
Yeah. But do you mind just taking a note, because it might be fairly cheap fix to just add that narrative to the wiki in that area.
About resources.
What do you mean?
There's a resource subsystem in Incubator.
Oh.
In net?
Yeah.
And also, I think the component service probably ought to go as well.
Oh, this is just a labor resource, not
shows
resource.
Yeah, the resource stuff's already there.
Yeah.
Which one did you say, Thomas?
The component service. Incubator component.
Net?
No, it's above net. Because it's more infrastructure, actually. That's the service for friendly activation and deactivation of components.
Oh, okay.
To reflect slightly different configurations of different components depending on what features are enabled.
Okay.
Okay.
I think a lot of these should be able to move fairly quickly. I think the only really, because the implementation nobody should be using directly, but the services I would just leave the shells there just for consideration. But clearly, for the most part, all internal references to them should be already moved as part of Loon release to their new location in core.
I think Bob just provided a link to our general feature proposal process, and maybe the documentation in the wiki advises people to create a Jira issue and check the TST so we can track them.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
Okay. Sure.
So One thing that wasn't entirely clear is kind of the justification for moving all these into the core. I mean, it may be obvious to you guys, but it might be worthwhile. We're sort of putting that at least in the notes for this meeting about what the systems do and why they are good enough or deserve to be part of the core.
Yeah, sure.
Or if it's not, or at least it may be documented elsewhere, like in the Loon, Loon release proposal or Loon feature list or something like that. But hopefully there's sort of a link to that so people can follow it. And presumably everybody in the room already agrees that these are important features and belong in, but it's not always. If you don't know them, it might be useful to just have some pointers.
Yeah.
I guess I would guess a core feature is something that everybody uses. I wonder if there's this other classification. There's core, contrib, and incubator. Where core really is just those apps that everybody uses.
Well, so the thing is, if you just as a quick reminder for what the purpose for the incubator is, right? I mean, normally we try to push as much functionality out towards the edge, towards the applications as basically as a means of having the features optionally loadable at runtime. However, there is definitely a set of functionality which we know should belong to the core, which is something that underlies everything. But because we don't want it to be subject to the same strict guidelines with respect to backwards compatibility, and allow things to evolve under a little less rigid structure, that's the whole point of the incubator. But the idea here is that the incubator, as the name suggests, should only really hold pieces of code for a limited amount of time. It should not be area of code where functionality squats for extended period of time. It either dies or it gets promoted out. And so the components that were named as sort of part of this suite were definitely in use for a number of releases already, and they've stabilized to the point where they really don't want this implicit beta tag, which is associated with the code being an incubator.
I understand that and agree, but let's take MCAST as an example. Should that be part of a core to a controller? Or that is more mature than incubator, but it's not core to a controller. If 10% of the population is using it, it's hard to call that core. So does it become this other section? There's incubator, there's contrib, for lack of a better name, and then there's core. And core are those things that are used by a large percentage, however large is defined, of the community. And again, I'll use like the OpenFlow as an example.
Yeah. So I guess I would argue that you don't introduce another category, and if it's something that's not used universally, I would suggest that we just make it an application, and then apps that do require that, let's say MCAST, to be present, they can specify that via dependency, application dependency, to make sure the code is loaded at runtime before they're loaded. That's effectively the contract.
So right? I guess I'm looking at the MCAST as an application. It's a loadable module. It's not a module that's going to be loaded and activated every time ONOS starts, because most people don't want to use it. So I'm still trying to figure out, in my mind, the word core has a connotation to it, which is that ONOS can't function without it.
So I can't really speak to the MCAST stuff, because the functionality that I was talking about more is truly the one that's related to the core.
Yeah,
but I finally found that
MCAST stuff is not used by certainly not the majority of people, probably a very small minority right now.
So let's move it to apps, right?
Yeah, if we're going to think about making that an app, that makes sense to me.
Okay, and that makes sense, right? Things that are the controller can't run without go to core. Things that are optional should go to apps in this case instead of contrib, which makes fine sense.
Yeah, I think the interface management, the neighbor management, and the component stuff and the routing stuff, I think those should go to the core. Though, admittedly, the routing stuff could potentially be also an application, right?
Yeah, I think if you make that argument for multicast, I think it's the same thing also applies to routing.
Yeah.
So I just pasted a link into the chat log so this is the sort of the official ONOS project lifecycle, and which I think there was some interest in following at some point. But there's a distinction between mature, which is that it's functioning and stable, and core, which is that it's a required component of the ONOS core. So maybe that addresses a little bit of what Jono was saying, that maybe some of these things are mature, they should be in applications or libraries, but they're not. And also what David's saying about whether something is like part of the ONOS core or not. So I don't know if you want to actually follow this procedure or not, but they actually mention graduation reviews and core reviews, and there's a sort of process that I don't know, it was apparently adopted at some point, or if this process is obsolete and will never actually be used by anybody.
Yeah, I mean, I think this sort of speaks to the middle area that David was alluding to. And I think what I'm hearing is that people think an appropriate place is not necessarily core, but it might be called apps.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess my recommendation would be to start moving the stuff from Incubator to core first, unless the dependency chain prevents us to do that or makes things more complicated, and only then move the bits that should go from Incubator to apps afterwards. That would be my recommendation.
Is that you suggesting take the interface and the neighbor stuff and move it to core and get that settled, and then take routing and Ncast to move to apps?
Exactly.
Or are you suggesting move everything to core and then move routing and Mcast to apps?
No. I was thinking simply move things that we decided that go to core, move them to core only, and then move directly those things that we thought should be apps from Incubator to apps directly.
Okay.
I don't think it's routines. I was just simply suggesting a staging, because it's more important for the core stuff to settle down first, right, than the apps. So by the virtue of the fact that we consider an application, that sort of implies that there are fewer clients to it than a core would have.
I think one thing we're going to run into at some point is what is our criteria of maturity. If another project comes up from Incubator sometimes and says, I want to be mature, and TST says no, and they go, well, you made interface and neighbor mature, why am not I mature? Without some formal policy in place, if you will, or way to distinguish what is mature, it runs into policy issues.
Yeah.
I mean, to follow up on what David said, in theory, there is, yeah, you've got it right on the screen right now. In theory, there's this process, but maybe that process is obsolete. It doesn't look like it was it ever used? Is it intended to be used? I don't know.
So it's a little bit, I mean, there's definitely some alignment here, but I think I view this process slightly independent from this. It was mostly sort of aimed for managing lifecycle of kind of separate projects, so larger pieces of work. But there's definitely some overlap and some interaction, so it's not entirely independent, for sure. But I guess I was, specifically with the Incubator area, for me, I'm just looking at it as basically this is a place for experimentation, largely for work which was from the onset envisioned to go into the core. And perhaps in our case, in some of these like Mcast and routing cases, it was mistakenly thought so. I probably should have started directly in applications. That's fine. But just my
idea that where it talks about.
Right. Go ahead, Bob. Sorry.
A bit, but I liked this thing under core review saying that, you know, that it could be, just a component or subsystem, but it also, for the core review, it says, viable, necessary, or broadly useful module, subsystem, or component of the ONOS.
Mm-hmm.
Looks like a little bit of a way to decide.
Yeah. Yeah, now it still doesn't speak to the maturity point that David brought out. I mean, if somebody has suggestions for how to sort of gauge that more formally, I'd be open for suggestion. I wasn't overthinking it too much in my case for this particular migration. I was just going based on the fact that I know that these modules have been in use for some time, and they haven't, they've been stable for a number of releases, and they're used fairly widely, and so they should move out of Incubator because clearly they've stabilized.
Great.
Do we do we know who would be conducting this work? We should probably we could probably create some tickets for this, and then we probably need to figure out how to pick up the work for so that it happens for Loon. If you want, I can create the tickets for it just to kick it off.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I can pick up some of the time.
All right, I'll create the tickets first thing tomorrow morning, and then we can then start considering it for the next sprint, which I believe starts next week, right?
Yep.
Perfect. Cool. And so on a previous point, do you have any sort of time estimates for when the module owner changes? We should be able to see those. Would there be something we want to take for starting the end release?
It's sort of orthogonal to the release process, right?
Okay.
So keep in mind, if you want this in the Loon release, that Sprint 3 review is next Friday, 8/11, and that's also our feature freeze.
Yes.
So it needs to be wrapped up by next Friday.
Technically, this isn't a new feature, though.
I know, but it's going to cause code churn.
Well, that's a good question. What does feature freeze mean? Feature freeze, is that the same as code freeze?
Yes. Well, except for bug fixes, right? The intent of that was to reduce the churn in the code so that we can get to a stable point.
So sure, we'll try to make it happen by then, but I think I can argue that this is not a new feature. This is simply opening the door around. But
Yeah, it sounds like, I thought you were talking about changes to the module owner process, and that's not changes, that doesn't involve changes to ONOS, right? That's changes to Carrot,
yes,
right?
sorry about that, was jumping the topic. I jumped back in the topic, but then Yen still had some questions about the
Right.
previous point.
So it might be easiest to do this right after code freeze or feature freeze, whatever you want to call that. And the reason I say that is because the check-ins that are targeting any of these areas or that use any of these areas would be required to be in by then. So the refactor might be easiest to do at that point.
Right.
I'm kind of into doing this sort of thing in a dev branch anyway, because it looks like, there are probably a bunch of, minor changes and bug fixes and things that will go wrong that they'll need to fix. And so if ONOS proper is kind of forked at that point to the release branch and the development branch, that might make sense.
Yeah. I mean, there's upsides and downsides to either approach, but
Yeah, definitely. I mean, increases the merging or the merge and integration post-release, which is the downside, I guess, which is possibly extensive. So I don't know. I guess either way, I guess works. It depends on the schedule, I guess.
I think my only concern is if we're doing this after the feature freeze and there's a lot of instability, will we hold up the release?
Sure. I see your point. I mean, so let's. I mean, we should certainly be able to. Again, hopefully there's not much churn in these areas, right? By the definition of maturity, and at least I don't recall seeing much churn in that area myself. So we should try to make it happen as quickly as possible. And if some of it spills past the feature freeze, I think that should be fine. My primary concern is to minimize the amount of merging work that it happens before creation of the maintenance branch. But I see Brian's point that if it happens afterwards, it would sort of make the move a little bit more, yeah, a lot less subject to merge issues. Downside is that we would have to cherry pick the changes from the maintenance branch to the dev branch or vice versa.
Yeah, I was actually advocating before the creation of the maintenance branch.
Yeah, I think if he could do it before. So to jump back to my original question, yeah, I definitely see that the module owner program thing is completely orthogonal. I was just looking for if you had a time in mind, and so I was just trying to.
Well, the reduce number of reviewers to 2, I think that's just a matter of clicking
Sure.
the button.
Okay.
The other one is a slight code change in the module owner plugin, but it should be fairly easy.
Okay, so basically we're looking for fairly soon.
Yeah.
Okay.
So that's, we'll just change the default so it defaults to 2 instead of 3.
Okay.
And then the other one, like I said, small code change. But the bigger question and the reason to kind of think about it from a TST perspective is because super module owners should start to think about if there are areas of the code base that they want to be flagged.
Yes, so that we can explicitly add those as patterns. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. All right.
Yep.
Does anybody have anything else to discuss today? Did you have anything, Jan?
We had talked about something on the drive back, but I can't remember.
I know, that's what that's why I know that there was something, but I forgot what it was, sorry. So I guess it's not that important using the Hemingway filter. If it's important, we will.
I just want to comment on the last thing, which is that there's this interesting thing where there's this idea of ONOS, I guess, libraries or middleware, things that export or provide services to other components. I guess components that provide services to other components, and maybe there's a logical way to separate those out or a different name of them. Sorry, that isn't called apps. Maybe it should be something else. But I guess it's something to think about as we think about sort of evolving the source tree to be more kind of OS-like or platform-like system.
Yeah. Possibly so.
There might be. I mean, apps is one thing, services another thing, libraries is perhaps another. I don't know. It's possible there may be some good name that describes these things or is a logical way of aggregating them. Or maybe we just call them all apps and say apps can provide services to other apps and call it a day. Yeah,
well, so we progressively, at least I have progressively been referring to them as ONOS, to the apps as ONOS extensions, because they, it's not just apps as in applications as we traditionally think of things like traffic steering strategies and stuff like that. But our apps today include drivers, providers, protocol libraries, monitoring utilities, test utilities, traffic steering applications, and things like that. So it's already kind of a hodgepodge of stuff. And actually there is, if you were to examine it, there's already a healthy number of relationships, dependency relationships between the applications. Where, for example, in order to load the ONOS UI, you have to load some other, ONOS Yang UI, you have to load a whole bunch of other applications that will get sort of dragged in with that application. So we already are using it that way, but perhaps using finding a better term than application, which is normally associated with just like things that are doing traffic. Might be a good idea.
Yeah, that's a good point, that existing like ONOS apps may actually include their own subsystems or drivers or things like that, which is kind of interesting. And they're sort of sliced by some sort of larger unit of functionality or something, even though they have a lot of components. I guess they could even have configuration components and other stuff. And yeah, it's a good question what to call them. Call them, packages or extensions, or maybe apps is just fine. And we'll say apps can be dependent on other apps, and apps can support APIs, and apps can provide services, et cetera. I mean, which is kind of what they do now.
Yeah, that's exactly what they do. Yep. All right. Well, if there's nothing else to discuss, I think we can call today's meeting closed. And we'll see everybody next week.
All right. Bye.
All right. Thanks, Brian, for running it. I presume you will record it, right?
Sorry.
Our alarm.
Great, thanks.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, bye.